Hi, I'm Dave Broom. I'm a whisky writer and one of the liquid antiquarians.
Hi, I'm Arthur Motley. I work in the whisky industry as a consultant, and before that, roll my whiskies. And yeah, Liquid Antiquarian. It's a YouTube channel, strange little corner of the internet that looks into past stories of alcohol and booze culture, trying always to look at primary evidence.
So this is really exciting. A first edition of Alfred Barnard's Whisky Distilleries of the United Kingdom, published 1887, the foundation stone of whisky writing. It's a remarkable, remarkable document, is it not?
Absolutely. No, as you say, it is the source of so much of the history, the early whisky writing history, I would say, of the 80s onwards, really, is based on this book. And it is still hugely valid today and worthy of revisit, actually.
Yeah, and basically he just went around all the distilleries. What's about 140 distilleries in Scotland, obviously, but also England, also Ireland, examining them in pretty forensic detail. So you can look at this book in so many different ways. As a historical document, it's a production document. And also as a guide, as a travel companion, as you're kind of virtually touring the whisky world at that time.
And it's the voice of one person as well.
Good point.
He went to all of them. So although his tone changes, you're getting the impression of one person going around the wilds of Scotland and Ireland and England and recording what he sees, what he feels.
It had never been done before, you see a couple, there's Tovey, there's Morewood, which are more kind of historical guides, an idea of, how whisky was made, etc. But nothing like this. It just suddenly emerges at a very important point in whisky's history as well.
A crucial time, just before another period of major change, just after a longer period of significant growth, and really the establishment of the whisky industry, growth, Alfred visits, and then there's a rocky time to come.
Yeah, we know the book, but we don't necessarily know the man behind the book, or it's not been that revealed.
I think we know a fair bit. I think you know quite a lot from this really interesting character that shines through in how he writes, who he interacts with. He's middle class, and you can really feel that in terms of when he goes to each distillery, he's introduced to the owner. He might meet him at the gates, but then he's shown round by the brewer or the distiller. He goes sailing with, I think, the distillery manager at Dallaruin. He talks to the coachman. He's firmly in that middle class area, and I really like him as well.
Yeah.
Really, he's a fantastic character.
Yeah, he comes through. I think the personality comes through. He's very, as in the Victorian term, he's a clubbable man. He's a comfortable character. He's comfortable in his own skin, but he seems he's intrigued as well. And from a writing point of view, what I love about it is the way in which he's not coming across as an expert in this book. He's coming across as the reader. He is as excited about these distilleries as anybody. So he's not coming and going, all right, I am now going to tell you everything that I know about it. He's learning all the way through. And I think the way in which he kind of juxtaposes the hardcore information about, what the distillery is and where it's come from, etc., with beautifully lyrical and often quite amusing travel writing. So it's a hugely entertaining book, as well as an incredible resource for people like us.
Yeah, that learning as he goes element, because he is a drinks journalist, I suppose, but before that he's had different careers as well. A soap salesman. Does he cut his family? His father's a plumber.
Father's a plumber. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thaxted,
living in South London or around those areas, and going on this amazing adventure. You feel this adventure, and the significance, I think, is partly because no one has done this before. There's been scattered little bits of writing, but nothing complete, nothing this snapshot. Yeah. Well, snapshot's understating it, actually. It's very comprehensive. They say they're going to go to every distillery, along with presumably the people. He has companions, presumably the people who do the wonderful illustrations as they go around. And it's just an extraordinary odyssey around a world that is very different in the whisky industry, but yet also familiar. It's very much changed from now, but then there's some things that feel the same. Yeah. And that's why it's really easy to connect with, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And also, I mean, you think about why it was written. You think about when it was written, 1880s. So you'd been researching for, I reckon, 2-3 years it probably took him to go around all of this. But why it was written, why it appeared at this point is actually for me one of the really interesting things, because it's written as a series of articles. It's coming from Harper's, which was and still is, the drinks trade journal. So you think it's aimed potentially at the trade, at their readership, but at the same time, it's illustrating a trade and an industry which is now gaining respectability, I think. It has achieved a certain mass, a critical mass, that it's worthwhile, cataloguing what is going on here.
That's a really interesting point about the book. Who is it for? Because it's an extraordinary commission to send this man up when no one had done anything like this before. And it's certainly for the trade. And on the trade side, that scale and significance of the whisky industry at this point is it's a crucial time, because it's now, I think, contributing 1/6 of the country's revenue through the excise that it raises. So it's very important to Great Britain. Yeah. So important from that side. Furthermore, you've also got new people investing in whisky now. He speaks of men owning distilleries, and their father or even grandfather started it for some of the very early ones. But you're also getting companies now that have formed, and companies of some scale that have formed, and new people from outside Scotland, London in particular, investing in whisky. So the book's reviewed in newspapers, and in those same newspapers, you've got share releases of significant scale. So that's middle-class people, bankers, whoever it might be, are starting to now invest in these distilleries. So it's logical to think that there's a market there for people who want to know the nuts and bolts, the scale. Yeah,
it's almost a prospectus in some way for these potential investors. Yeah. I also think it's, it speaks of that middle-class respectability that whisky has now gained. It's now firmly established in the clubs of London, and people are investing in it. It's it's raising lots of money, etc. But I think it also appeals to the interested Victorian gentleman. You can imagine him sitting in his club because he is interested in finance, but he's interested in engineering and interested in travel. I look at the book through in kind of all these different lenses, really, as a great resource, a historical resource, as a production resource, even though some bits tantalisingly not filled in, but also as it's got this, because of that travel aspect of it, it's got this vestigial air of the romantic, when he's describing, the fairy glen that he takes the coach through to get to Dalyun, or the terror. He seems to be very, very scared of heights. Anytime he goes above sea level, it's kind of I'm in the wilds, in the bleak moorland and everything, which is classic Victorian romantic vision of Scotland. So if you are a middle class British gentleman, it's appealing on one hand to the travel, and also it's appealing on the other hand to this love of engineering which the Victorians had.
Yeah, and you feel him in the outdoors of Scotland as well, a lot.
With his tiny hat on.
Yeah. And there's beautiful descriptions of the weather and the journeys by coach and the journeys by train. And you feel him coming from London and working in London and being in awe of this beautiful nature and these elements and the purity of Scotland, I suppose, if you can summarise it. But you're totally right. It's not just for the trade. And I think he wrote that in by design. He wanted it to have a slightly broader appeal to the consumer. And you see that reflected in the reviews in the newspapers of the time. They talk about, most of the reviews actually, they talk about, now this might seem like a book for the trade, but actually it's really interesting as well. And it's well written. And you even see it advertised just in a normal newspaper. So it was designed to have that appeal beyond just people who had a direct involvement in the trade, of which there were many. If you think of all the merchants who had been trading in whiskey, maybe doing a bit of blending and selling whiskey, no one really knew that much about these places. And he was opening the door to these distilleries. He was describing them in great detail. He was describing what they felt like. He was almost giving instructions how to get there as well.
Yes.
There are travel instructions.
You get this ferry, or you get, there's a coachman here waiting for us, this train, etc.
Make sure you don't get stuck in this place as well, because that can be difficult.
And the inn is rather beautiful. It's all these interesting little tips.
Or awful, he also says.
He had high standards.
High
standards. And you do find him kind of sneaking in, his personality, and falling in love with whiskey. It's unclear whether it's a chronological account of his travels, but as you get into the book, you begin to realise that Alfred himself is beginning to fall in love with whiskey, and
I think so.
There are a few mentions of he had an excellent lunch, and he was sitting with the manager or the brewer, and we had a few glasses. I think particularly in Ireland, I think he loved his tour of Ireland. And one point he's swept up in an Irish home rule demonstration, and he seemed to have an absolutely fantastic time. I think by that time he's really fully immersed in the world of whiskey. You see a whiskey lover beginning to emerge from all of this.
And with that, the people as well, the people that he meets. It's sometimes viewed as cold somehow, Barnard, because I think people get distracted by the size of the mash tuns and all the descriptions of Morton's refrigerators and all that type of stuff. But it's really human. You feel this guy going to all these distilleries and meeting all these people and getting on with them and having fun with them. And I really love that about it.
And it's a logistical feat. It's extraordinary. You step back and you think, okay, right, this is the 1880s, and he's travelling to every distillery. How does he do it? Because you've got trains, but you've then got ferries, you've got coaches, you've got, I would love to see the archive. I would love to see the memos and the letters that Alfred was writing to all these distilleries, going, I would like to visit your distillery on this particular day. And how the whole journey was actually pieced together. It's an extraordinary logistical feat.
But at the same time, it's now possible.
It's possible to do, yes, of course.
And it emphasises to you, or to me, as I read it, how remote a lot of these distilleries were, and why on earth did they build a distillery there? And because they still had to get the stuff off and on. But now it has become possible, but not easy.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, if you're going all the way up to Stromness, then it's, that's a long journey.
Yeah, no.
Even now.
But a huge achievement from him and the people who presumably helped him. He talks of letters of recommendation and all these little tidbits that make you admire him.
Yeah, there's contacts there. Please recommend me to my to your friend. maybe they met in a club or something. Oh yes, you know so and so. Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I was thinking of going to visit his distillery. I wonder if you could furnish me with an invitation. It's a remarkable book. It's a great social history, great whiskey history, great production history. It's a hugely invaluable resource because, as you said, nothing like this had appeared before. So it's the start of something very important.
Absolutely. And with our work with the Liquid Antiquarian, which tries to start with primary objects and paper and the pure tactile joy of holding beautiful old objects and old pieces of paper. This is extremely special, as not just the work that Alfred Barnard did, but this object here, packed with beautiful illustrations, wonderfully printed. There's beautiful gold embossing and everything about it. This is just such a beautiful book.
Yes, yeah. So it's, book lovers would love it, whiskey lovers would love it. Yeah, it's extremely rare. It's glorious just to look at it.
And at the time, in the reviews as well, they spoke about what a...
Yes, yeah, they're hugely enthusiastic about all of that. And I think the fact it was reviewed, when you go back to newspaper archives and actually say, well, yeah, it's there and it's being covered not just in the trade, it's in the Dundee Advertiser. Yeah, that's a huge screed about it. It made quite an impact because he followed this up with a similar tour going around all the breweries. And when you read the reviews of that book, they're all talking about this was written by Alfred Barnard, who you will remember wrote, the Whisky Distilleries of the United Kingdom. So it's already there. It's in the canon. He is now a known author. So it had an impact. It really had an impact. And to actually see the very book that started it all, to see this edition is just hugely exciting.
And the way the reviewers in the newspapers talk about it, this is a good publication for its time. Not the content, the actual book itself. This is a book that was expensive and people spent that money because they were very proud to have this on their shelf at a time, which is an extraordinarily high quality period of bookmaking. And they talk about this as one of the best in class.
A handsome volume. But it's also important to put this within context of like when it was written and what the whisky industry was going through at that particular time, because 1880s were just moving towards another great kind of pulse of distillery building. So you had a whole number of distilleries built 1816, and that kind of rush in 1823 into 1830s. A lot closed down. There's another kind of pulse as railways come in the 1860s. And now, then, tail end of the 19th century, boom, another load are suddenly emerging. So it's an important account of the whisky industry, which seems to be in very, very rude health.
Yeah, I mean, you could pick any time in history pretty much to say it would be great if someone would go around and record all those distilleries. But this is pretty much perfect, I would say, because you still have this reaching back to the very beginning of the establishment of the industry through a few generations. But you've had a period of renewal. Lots of the distilleries, they've been updated and new bits of kit put in and efficiency starting to come in.
Electric light,
for example. And some distilleries are starting to be able to build significant volume and have been through periods of renewal. But at the same time, you've got some distilleries that appear virtually unchanged since the start. So there's lots of contrasts within there, which is fascinating. And the reader immediately starts to think about who survived, who didn't survive, why one distillery did and not the other.
Yeah.
And then there's the regionality of course about it as well. Campbelltown obviously jumps out because there are still a lot of distilleries there. the vast majority don't survive. Just
Yes,
two within this book, Scotia, as it is called, which we now know as Glen Scotia, and Springbank. So you read those and you're thinking, well, why you? And you kind of read with a sadness about the lost distilleries, but then also an excitement. You're like, go on, Springbank.
Go on. You're going to be okay.
Yeah. And so that's fascinating, absolutely fascinating to see that.
And I find that the parallels are really interesting, and it actually came when I was looking at that Dundee Advertiser review, because it's less of a review. It's sort of saying this book has arrived, and it's allowing the author of the piece to then have a really pretty detailed and quite a prescient review of what the Scottish whisky industry was like at that particular time. So written in 1887, and he's going, this book has appeared, and there's all these distilleries in there. So well done, Alfred Barnard. But the industry is in overcapacity. Too much whisky is being produced. Consumption, local consumption, i.e. in Scotland and England, is in decline. If the whisky industry is to survive, it has to start exporting. And it's a really, really fascinating piece because, with the benefit of hindsight, you go, yeah, he was absolutely right, the guy who wrote this.
He was right in two ways. The industry did start exporting a lot more, but also what follows is more distilleries after this and more expansion after. It's not like they stop.
Yeah.
And it carries on even further. But there are some difficult times just around the corner, and he captures it just before that moment.
Because we're entering this period of rampant speculation of people investing in distilleries, investing, dare I say it, in casks and all of that as well.
And he actually likes it. There's the old and the new, which I love about Alfred Barnard. And he loves both. He talks about the old pot stills of the original type, which we never quite know what that means, but the really old style pot stills. He admires the person who's been working at the distilleries for 30, 40 years and learned from his father. But at the same time, he's in awe of this Victorian engineering and the scale of some of these huge distilleries. And one I particularly like is Yoka, which has some really, really old features, made millions of gallons a year, I think. So it's really, really sizable, but yet has some really old-fashioned elements to it and really reaches back to the past. So they're kind of both things within one distillery with beautiful old weird little rooms, and they're also doing little science experiments as well. So there's elements of that coming through.
Just beginning the distillery lab is just beginning to formulate.
Yeah. But that doesn't survive.
Yes.
And then you have the examples of the ones that do, like Springbank, that somehow managed to cling on. And why did that manage to succeed? And the answer isn't really in there. It comes down to a lot of factors like ownership and who decided to shut them down. Because very often it was a decision to shut down distilleries, or rather a decision not to reopen them. Distilleries shut down all the time and wait until the time is right to reopen. But Springbank and Glen Scotia, they managed to cling on.
They survived. Perhaps because they were more efficient,
He does talk about the number of people working at distilleries. Not for everyone, and I did a bit of comparison and dividing volume by number of people who worked there. And bizarrely, or it was amusing to me anyway, because of the way we talk about Springbank was one of the more efficient. In fact, apart from Hazelburn, it was the most efficient of the Campbelltown distilleries. Which is not how we talk about Springbank now.
No. And also, you place it in context of all the closures from 1900, and a huge number closed down in the 1920s. And who was closing down? A lot of them were very small distilleries. You kind of go back and you look and say, well, actually, I'm not surprised they closed down, because they were making whiskey in a very old-fashioned way, and it was a really small distillery. The industry is in crisis. We're going to close this down. We're either going to shut it completely, or we're going to close it down. So Yeah, I think just isolating Campbelltown is missing the point to some extent, because the rest of Scotland was Perthshire was decimated.
For the second time.
Yeah,
That was their second crash.
Yeah.
Campbelltown is the crash we think of because it's kind of the most recent. But the Aberdeen whiskey industry is in rude health here. 3 distilleries, I think, maybe 4. They're all gone at the same time as Campbelltown.
Borders have gone as well. So, you know that late 1920s, especially, boom, that was kind of scorched earth for so many distilleries. And the seeds are kind of in there.
Yeah.
It's really interesting in that respect.
You can absolutely read the text like that. And if you're talking about closure and not reopening, which I think is more accurate, some distilleries do just go bust, privately owned distilleries or very small groups, they go bust. But those distilleries can go bust and someone larger can reopen them. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
So there were decisions by which ones to buy up all the stock and buy the distillery and which ones to reopen. And who makes that decision? And you see a crucial period here about who is buying the whiskey and who has control of the industry. DCL exists, what would later become Diageo, but it's nothing like the DCL, the distillers company that would follow. They don't quite have that power within the industry. And that is starting to shift as well. Because, of course, the customers are partly the blenders.
Yes.
And their power starts to increase from this period onwards.
You're beginning to see the blenders buying distilleries at this point. They're wanting control of their own supply, or as much control of their own supply as they can, which then is just increase, during the 20s.
Owning the distillery or having part ownership in this distillery is one thing, but also the power of purchasing. So Dalhousie Distillery, I think, which he's very impressed by, James Watson of Dundee buys all the stock. They don't own the distillery, but they buy all the stock. That is power.
Yes.
That is starting to increase as time goes along. And if we all probably know about the Patterson's crash, and that's another example of blenders coming in and, it going wrong. And that is just around the corner.
Yeah. But also interesting, in a contemporary context about, we're looking at Scotch whisky probably having to adjust supply at the moment, so the cyclical nature of Scotch, but also some of the distilleries which closed down are now reopening. You think of Portellin, which closed in 1930, then didn't reopen until 1960s. You think of Brora, or the original Clynelish, which is in here as well. And you think of where we are today, Rosebank, classic example of popularly called ghost distilleries who are now kind of reviving themselves.
Rosebank's interesting with the context of this book as well, because it survives the disasters of the 20s and 30s, which is really limping along from Patterson's and into other various world events. It survives that because of its location, because of the canal.
Yeah.
And he always says in a bit of detail, it's near a rail line, it's near a canal, it's near a steamer route. And you can kind of read into the book why some do and don't survive. Rosebank survives that period, but then not the 90s. Mm-hmm. The canal is no longer relevant.
Yes.
Probably, I imagine, full of shopping trolleys.
Yes, it was a negative factor, actually. This should have been a classic malt, but unfortunately it was next to a disused canal with no car parking at that particular point. So, the decisions were slightly different at that particular point.
Yeah. Road transport has replaced canal transport a long time ago. So Rosebank doesn't survive, I think we can accept for that reason. But now we see this resurgence in distilleries like Rosebank, but also over in Ireland. And that customer base has changed so significantly now, because a distillery like this is able to exist, and distilleries in Ireland, their purpose for being built is because the customer has changed. It is the product of those stills, unchanged, not as an ingredient within a blend, and that person who is controlling what gets bought and put into a blend is now going much more direct to that consumer. It's no longer an ingredient.
Yeah.
And that is a big shift in a reason for a distillery existing. And I think one of the reasons we've seen this incredible revival in new distilleries being built and old ones being reopened.
Yeah. I mean, there's elements of resilience. It's always interesting going back, in today's context, and then going back, right, what was it like in Barnard's time? I'm constantly kind of going back and referring back to, what was, are there any clues as to what the flavour of the whiskey was like, or, how was it made, etc. And then, spinning forward, just looking at, my goodness, they survived a lot of crises. Because Scotch whisky was on its uppers in the early 30s. 2 distilleries in operation in 1932 in Scotland. There were fears that the entire industry would collapse. So, and we tend to forget all of that. That whisky didn't just sail majestically, continuing to rise inexorably, during the 20th century. It was up and down and up and down and up and down. And just picking away at what Alfred was saying, almost like a subtext of the book, you can see some of the issues and the problems beginning to emerge, within that wider historical context. And that's another reason why it's still relevant today. It's not this interesting but slightly dry tome about a past that simply doesn't exist. It's part of whisky's continuum. So you can read it in so many different ways. So it's very, very important, for anybody who's interested in whisky and the way that whisky has evolved. This is a foundational text, important.
Undeniably. Yeah. Because, of course, we all know that the whisky industry is a trade that is subject to boom and bust is a bit strong, but, it goes through periods of extreme difficulty. And it's common to talk about the weakness of the whisky industry as being the difficulty of having to predict what you're going to sell in 3, 5, 8 years, whatever it might be. And undoubtedly that is difficult. But I'm starting to think as well, is part of its strength that a distillery can close temporarily, but it still has product. And that keeps it alive. And I think Rosebank's a great example of that as well. That, I don't know, if you made a particularly tasty type of biscuit, you go through a difficult period, your factory shuts down, that biscuit is dead now. It goes out of date. Whiskey carries on maturing. It still exists, and it allows people to still try and appreciate this whiskey. And actually, in the case of distilleries like Rosebank and Port Ellen, its legend actually grows. And that gives it that opportunity to reopen. So there's extraordinary resilience within the whisky industry that businesses manage to survive over long periods of time and crossing economic growth and economic depression. And part of the reason is these beautiful casks of whiskey sitting in the warehouse that keep that name alive in people's minds. And
I think it's also because the nature of whiskey has changed. Because the story of whiskey in the 20th century, Scotch whiskey in the 20th century, is blends. But the story and the interest in Scotch whiskey today, even if not necessarily in terms of volume, is single malt. So I think it's interesting for me to think about Barnard within that historical context of writing about whiskey. Because this was the first. Then there was a series of articles, again in trade journals, which was reprinted recently in 1927 and 1920s. So you've got insight into what was happening in the 1920s, again, just before a crash. There probably was some round about the 1950s, but it really wasn't until Michael Jackson appears that you begin to see writing about whiskey and whiskey distilleries once again. So
It's a big gap, isn't it?
it's a huge gap. So, and nobody was talking about Barnard. Barnard was irrelevant in that particular context because the story was blends. And Barnard really only started becoming relevant again when people became interested in single malt whiskey. And with that, you discover all these kind of forgotten distilleries and lost distilleries and ghost distilleries. You go, oh yeah, I wonder what it was like. And suddenly Barnard, the focus is back on, and suddenly Barnard becomes relevant again.
So
because this was a forgotten book. Nobody knew about this book. For most of the 20th century, nobody knew about this book because it wasn't relevant to the way in which whiskey was talked about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the rise of single malt culture discovered Barnard again.
Yeah.
And then Barnard contributed so much back to the single malt culture.
Yeah.
And contributed to places like this being able to reopen in some sense.
Because you look at Michael's book, and Michael would have been the first person to accept this and admit this. This was a template for what Michael did. And it was a template for what the Schweppes book, what Philip Morris, that book as well, because all of a sudden, the whiskey ship is turning, and the way in which it's talked about, and the way that a new community is becoming interested in whiskey. Suddenly, this becomes such an important text. Otherwise, it would have just been forgotten.
You knew Michael better than me. A lovely man.
A lovely man.
I knew that much.
Sure.
And I just wondered, do you see parallels between Michael in particular and Alfred?
Yes, hugely. I think the way that Michael was an incredibly lyrical writer, he was the proper successor to Alfred. I mean, he didn't copy what Alfred did, but I think that the way in which you would write about whiskey, which interweaving, the idea of this is in a place, a distillery, this is in this specific place, it has this history, and this is also how it is made. It's kind of, the template was established by Alfred Barnard. I think it needs to move on. I think, there's an awful lot of whiskey writing which is a bit too simplistic and a bit too obsessed with the, how big the mash tun is, etc., without asking the why are you doing this, which is what Michael was always really, that's what he taught me. Ask the why, don't ask the what. You ask the what, but really it's the why are you doing this that's actually important, because that leads to flavour. So this is a foundational text, and it has contributed massively to this thing called whiskey writing, which has really only emerged in the past 20 years, really.
I like the parallel with Michael because he also carved out a career that didn't exist.
Yes, yeah.
Alfred absolutely did that. I mean, the idea is just absurd to be able to be paid to go around in those days, all these distilleries.
Was it his idea?
It's
him trotting up to Harper's, kind of going, "I've got a great idea, guys. You have to." I mean, nobody would do this. As an impoverished writer, if I went to a magazine and said, "You know what I would like to do? I would like to spend 2 years going around the United Kingdom writing about every single distillery, and will you pay me? Will you pay all my expenses?" I would be shown the door.
First class as well.
First class. Yeah. Damn, I should ask for that. I need to get onto my agent. But I think you can joke about it, but I think it shows the way in which the whiskey industry was viewed by Harper's as being important, that they could invest a serious amount of money and time sending somebody first class around Britain. That speaks volumes about the role and the significance of the industry at the time.
I love the little entry in, I think it's at Balmenach, and I think it's the only, that's why he's travelling first class, because they buy a first class ticket, and the ticket number is number 1. It's the first ever first class ticket that has ever been sold at that train station, and the train station has existed for 20 years. It's an interesting point as well, actually, and Michael Jackson made me think of it as well, is a lot of modern whiskey writing is about trying to work out why it tastes like it does. And that's maybe why we spend too much time talking about mash tuns and fermentation time, and that can be very off-putting to a more casual reader, and that's maybe a fault in how we write about whiskey. But that's what we all want to know, this mystery of this relatively simple drink with very few ingredients. Why do they all taste so different? You know, that is the fascination of single malt. And within this book, you do get a snapshot of opinions of why their whiskey, in the eyes of the distillery manager, tastes better than all the other whiskies.
Yeah.
And the reasons are pretty scattered, pretty varied. The peat that might come from Orkney a lot of the time. Yeah. The water is obviously mentioned. They use water from this loch for making the whiskey, and then water from the river for cooling or whatever. So they have rarefied ideas about that. Stills are, people talk about, you know, the old, you make a better soup in an old pot kind of analogy, but not shapes. That's never mentioned. So you do get kind of some idea of this mixed up version of why whiskey tastes like it does. And still the idea of, because it's from Scotland, because it's from these mad little islands, because the air is pure, because nature is somehow carving this beautiful spirit out of this place, which I think we believe a little less now, is fair to say. But we're still working that out. And actually a lot of the ideas and views of why whiskey tastes like it does actually do still come from this book right up until the... Yeah. When would you say, 80s?
Yeah, and also I think that the area of most relevance, I think, to today's drinker or today's industry is Ireland. Because, you know, it collapsed, the industry collapsed in Ireland in the 20th century. You know, there were 2 distilleries in Ireland in the 1980s. And now, you know, we know there's 45, there's 50 of them. But you have this complete lost history of Irish whiskey. In a very, very important time. You know, Scotch kind of takes over. So if you're an Irish distiller, this suddenly becomes a really important text, because you can now look back and see what these massive distilleries in Dublin and Cork, you know, and Bandon were making, you know, the scale of it. And from that, you can begin to deduce, you know, what the style of pot still was like. And actually look at those glory days, but not looking at those glory days in a kind of nostalgic way of, okay, oh my God, we were so great and now we are nothing. Actually as a foundation once more of something to build upon with a new Irish industry. So I think I'm fascinated by the Irish chapters in this, which tend to get overlooked because there's fewer distilleries, etc. But I think from that contemporary relevance point of view, I actually find them more compelling than Scotch, actually.
And the reason they get overlooked is probably because Irish whiskey in the modern era didn't have the reference points, because they didn't have the brands for sale. Exactly. So that comes back to this idea of modern single malt culture feeding off this. Yeah. And yeah, you're quite right, because the Irish industry at this point is successful, it's scaled.
Yeah, so it's in rude health. It's the gold standard of whiskey at this particular point.
Exactly. The whiskey is very good and they've managed to get to great scale, but yet it doesn't work. Yeah. And the answer there is blending again, isn't it?
It is. Blending and politics.
Yeah, that did come into it.
Yeah, we won't go down that route.
No.
So why is this still relevant then, Arthur?
My personal reflection on having been back through Barnard more in the last couple of weeks than I have done for a long time is it's actually more relevant than ever. And I probably should have been dipping into it a lot more than I have, because the way we viewed whiskey has changed again. I've been working 25 years, whatever it is, in the whiskey industry. And of course, you went straight to Barnard when you start learning about whiskey. And for me, it was absolutely time to go back. And I took so much more out of it, because the way we look at production now is different again. You know, we have got all these small distilleries, but that doesn't mean they're traditional. They're nothing like the small distilleries in these. And what the new distilleries are doing is incredibly innovative and incredibly interesting, and it's sometimes couched in looking at the past, but that's just scale. You know, these small distilleries are incredibly efficient compared to these things.
Sure.
And there's so much to learn about how they made whiskey in the past. You have to really pick it apart and take these little tidbits and kind of add them up into some kind of a picture. It's clues. It's a kind of it's a mystery.
Yes.
That you have to piece these little bits together. But it's great fun. It's a great document of a different Scotland. It's a great document of a different whiskey industry. And I think it's a really compelling portrait of a man, although you have to just interpret his voice.
Yeah.
Who was doing something amazing. He was adventuring.
Yes, he was going where no man had gone before. This kind of mad, kind of quixotic tour around Britain, you know, finding out all of these facts. I think, I would agree. I think it's more relevant than ever these days, especially with new distillers. Sort of saying, actually, the industry has gone so far down the efficiency and yield route that we need to pick up some of the old ways of making whiskey, and how did they make it? You know, so you've got to go back to these texts to actually say what it was like, and you can look at this book in so many ways. So yeah, it's hugely relevant, hugely relevant.
It's been part of whiskey culture for a long time, when it was rediscovered. But I took it a little for granted, actually.
Yeah.
And it's just a fabulous part of our culture.
Yeah. I mean, I love reading it. I mean, I read it in so many kind of different ways. I sometimes will just pick up Barnard and just read about the journeys. You know, just because, you know, it's such a... Because I'm really interested in that whole place thing, and, you know, why distillery is where it is. And actually getting the lyrical descriptions of location, I think are really important. I think that gives that extra gloss, an extra depth even to the story that lies behind that distillery. You know, why was it built there? You know, maybe it's simply, you know, for a commercial reason. But also, you know, what was the thinking behind it? If it's a really old distillery, you know, why is it there? And also, you know, from a Glasgow point of view, you're looking at kind of the lost whiskey history of the cities, you know, which has essentially been completely erased as well. So, yeah, there's so much in there.
It's also so rare, actually, to get descriptions of people that worked at the distilleries. Get any interaction with them at all. We hear about Hugh Monroe, or the founders of these distilleries, but it's rare to get any voice from the people below that level who work in the distillery, and there's a lot in there as well. And the first time I looked at Barnard, I was one of those people who was like, how many stills do they have? How big's their mash tun? And now when I go back to it, it is the little peek into that time in Scotland, in extremely remote communities, and the wonderful interactions with the people middle class and below who operated those places and built that industry. And it's pretty unique for that.
You know, if you're interested in whiskey history, if you're interested in amassing a collection of vital elements within whiskey, whether that's liquid or whether that is text, you know, this is so important.